We've had these conversations with implementing curriculum and thinking about these components. And one essential part that I always think about is that when we can get institutional buy-in, whatever that may be, when the goals of the curriculum are aligned really well with the mission and vision of the institution, I've personally found that the likelihood of implementation success skyrockets and is much greater. What else? What have you seen? What else have you observed?
Well, I mean, simply put, that's just called stakeholder engagement. And it's a key component in knowing who your stakeholders are and who you're creating curricula for. And it's very interesting that this step then overlaps with your needs assessment steps 1 and 2. But what are the stakeholders' needs and goals, and how do they align with the curriculum you intend to create? So for me, a major stakeholder is the residency program. I find out the needs of the program director and the residents and how they align with the goals of the hospital leadership. So for instance, our central line insertion program is a great example of how we engaged our stakeholders to help solve a common problem. Our hospital was having issues with central line associated bloodstream infections. The leadership had identified issues with central line insertion as one of the key factors for the infection rate. And during their ICU rotations, internal medicine residents insert the majority of lines in patients. Additionally, at that time, our residents were required by the American Board of Internal Medicine to be competent in central line insertion. So after talking to our key stakeholders, including the residency program director, hospital and nursing leadership, and of course, the internal medicine residents, goals were aligned and a central line insertion simulation-based training curriculum was created. And because these goals were aligned with all the stakeholders, we were able to get the buy-in and we were able to secure the supplies and the time needed to actually do the simulations.
Again, a great example of how stakeholder engagement is so important in all of the different steps of curriculum development. And so this brings us to the 6th step of curriculum development, which is evaluation and feedback. Here, the curriculum designer thinks about the evaluation of the program as well as the individual assessment of learner performance. When evaluating the curriculum, we can look at translational outcomes as well. For example, did the learner's overall skills or attitudes improve as a result of the curriculum? Did patient care outcomes improve when the learners provided care at the bedside? The individual assessment of the learner occurs to ensure each individual is obtaining the required knowledge or skills described in the objectives.
Yeah, there's one key point I want to make here that I find striking, and that's that assessments are of the individual learners and evaluation is of the program. And when you actually combine the overall assessments of the individual learners, it can be used as a program evaluation tool to basically show that learning occurred. But it's imperative that we create tools for assessment that are both valid and reliable so that they produce data that we can rely on for promotion or for actually determining the individual is ready to move on to the next educational unit. I personally like to use checklists, certainly skills checklists for simulation, and specifically for tasks that have really well-defined steps. An example is the American Heart Association guidelines for arrhythmia. Another example is how to insert a central line. These steps are very well defined. It becomes much more difficult when tasks are more complex, such as an entire care package, like taking care of managing a diabetic patient. So David, we talked about the Thomas and Kern model. Now let's specifically talk about the differences that need to be made in that model so that mastery learning or simulation-based mastery learning can fit in.
So the really neat thing, Jeff, with curriculum development and mastery learning is that the general framework presented by Thomas and Kern can still be used in the exact same way. Mastery learning just simply impacts some of these steps. Step 1 and 2, the general needs assessment and the targeted needs assessment, are identical, the exact same process that you would use to build any other curriculum. For step 3, writing objectives and thinking about your goals for the curriculum, mastery learning is absolutely going to impact this step. Instead of thinking about and trying to define how well each objective has to be performed and when it will be performed by, mastery learning provides insight in how to address those. The how well each objective needs to be performed will be determined by the establishment of a minimum passing standard. When these objectives will be accomplished is by the end of the curriculum or the end of a unit or the end of a segment that the learner has to be able to achieve before moving on to the next step of increasing difficulty as defined by mastery learning. So for our previous ACLS example, our new mastery learning objective could become something like all second and third year internal medicine residents will meet or exceed a minimum passing standard on a skills checklist designed to measure adherence to the AHA guidelines during cardiac arrests after a simulation-based training. After writing objectives, the next part is to move on to the educational strategies. And by definition, in choosing to create a mastery learning curriculum, you have identified the key educational strategy that you're going to use, and that's mastery learning. And it's really important as you're designing this curriculum to fully embrace and include the components of the mastery learning curriculum, which includes the baseline assessment, the opportunities for additional learning and deliberate practice, the initial post-test, and then subsequent practice and post-testing if the minimum passing standard isn't achieved.
Deliberate practice, David, is one of the key, most important features, most important educational strategies of simulation-based mastery learning. And it helps ensure that at post-tests, our learners are able to reach the minimum passing standard. The late Anders Ericsson wrote a book called Peak, P-E-A-K, that defines all the research as to how he came up with the concept of deliberate practice. He studied professional chess players, professional athletes, professional musicians, and he really looked at what differentiated the absolute best of the best from those that were mediocre or just good. And he revealed that the way they practiced was different, and he called it deliberate practice. They were focused, they worked hard, they got feedback from a very expert instructor. And this expert instructor was one that would easily be able to meet a minimum passing standard if tested. They were someone that had been doing it for years with a lot of experience and really knew the best learning models. The learner and the teacher sweat during deliberate practice. It's hard work and something that really requires discrete focus.
Jeff, I really want to emphasize that last part, which is hard work. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the success of a curriculum is not how the curriculum designer feels about it or how we as facilitators react. It's not about us. It's about the learners and them acquiring new skills or attitudes or whatever it is that we're trying to teach in the new curriculum.
I agree completely. Dave, you also talked a little bit about the minimum passing standard. And we get the minimum passing standard through a standard setting exercise. We're not going to get into that now, but we will have another podcast specifically dedicated to how to perform standard setting. David, I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I hope that our listeners learned a lot.
It's always fun to talk about mastery learning with you, Jeff. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all for listening today. In the next podcast, I will be interviewing Dr. Celia O'Brien on how to create assessments in mastery learning, and more specifically, how to ensure these assessments provide valid and reliable data. Bye for now.